Hey y'all, how we doing? Shout out to Bear Nation for tuning in for another episode of the Bare Necessities of Entrepreneurship, a podcast for the entrepreneur-minded, created by entrepreneurs, discussing the real stories that give you the tools to overcome challenges and stay true to your real self. As always, I want to give a shout out to our partners over at Fin. Fin is a social good platform that creates employee engagement and builds culture. We've teamed up with Fin to give back to the communities that we serve. For every episode, we will be donating $10 to the cause of choosing by our guest in the Fin platform. Enjoy today's episode. Hey everybody, we are back once again for another episode of the Bare Necessities of Entrepreneurship podcast. And today is going to be an interesting one. I'm excited to bring on our guest to talk about a different side of entrepreneurship, the investor side. So my guest today is a friend of mine who we met randomly through our connections in New York. Happened to both be from the Midwest, which we love to talk about our experiences from Midwest to New York. Abby Lyall is the vice president at Big Idea Ventures, where she invests in early stage companies in food and food technology. She was also previously the second employee at Quake Capital, which was an industry agnostic VC and accelerator. And she has her degree from NYU's Stern School of Business. So Abby, thank you for being a part of Bear Nation today.
Thank you so much for having me, Rob. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. And I have to tell the listeners, there is a event that we went to called Web Summit in 2019.
Oh my God, that feels like it was 10 years ago.
It feels like it, right? Before the world shut down. And we were in Lisbon.
I was a totally different person then.
Yeah. I think we all were a totally different person. And so we all went down. So I went for the whole week. A lot of us went down for Web Summit. We spent the whole week there. Abby had another event. She flew in late, came in for 2 days, lack of sleep. But we went out at this little bar called Lisboa Vadia, where we ended up singing karaoke and playing music till about 4 a.m. And I will never forget that night.
It was so fun. I was so drunk that night, I almost missed my plane flight. I rolled out of bed, I didn't set an alarm, somehow miraculously woke up just in time to barely make it to the airport, so hungover. But it was totally worth it. We had such a blast.
We did. And they had this wine that was grown from a local farmer just outside the city. In fact, Francis and the Weave, formerly Numa squad, went back, and I connected them to Teresa because I still stay in touch with that bar. They still talk about us in that night from all the years ago.
Great.
So,
we were the life of the party. They had the wine, and then they also had that liqueur, that local liqueur, which was so good. It was,
Yeah. So the next morning, I went to the airport. I made it on time. I bought 2 bottles of wine to take home, and I fell asleep waiting for the plane to board. And then they woke me up hey, you got to board the plane. And I left the wine underneath my seat at the Lisbon airport. 2 bottles of amazing wine that I forgot in the airport.
Oh, no. That's a loss. That's a tragedy.
It was a tragedy. But, such is life. And so I bring that story up to kind of kick things off because, Abby and I met through our ecosystem. And I really would love for you to give us a quick background on you and how you got into the world of VC and why, I know this is kind of a long side of it, but why is investing in technology, specifically food tech, so interesting to you?
Yes. Happy to talk a little more about my background and my journey. As Rob mentioned, I'm from the Midwest. I'm from Ohio originally. I moved to New York in 2014 to go to NYU's business school. I studied finance and computer science there. I started a company while I was there. That was something that I sort of randomly fell into doing. When I first started off at Stern, there was a lot of pressure to go towards investment banking or, a traditional finance route. That's what most people were doing. And that just wasn't really a cultural fit for me. I didn't really, I'm not a really big company person. I don't like hierarchy. I don't like being told what to do. I'm much more of a, make my own rules and march to the beat of my own drum type of person. So sort of fell into starting a company with a friend from college. It was in the education technology space. we failed miserably at it. I was a horrible CEO. We made every mistake in the book. But it was such a valuable learning experience. I really had 2 years to kind of make all of the mistakes myself and get that hands-on experience starting a company. Within the sort of practice field of life that is a university setting, and with grant money and things like that from the university, which was fantastic. So through that experience of starting my company, I got really baked into the entrepreneurship ecosystem at NYU, which was really fantastic. Met a lot of great people through that. And one of the people that I met through that ecosystem, Brandon Meyer, he was a friend of mine. He was starting a VC fund called Quake Capital with a few other folks. So he asked me if I wanted to come on board as an early employee. I joined that firm while I was still in college, actually, in 2016, and helped build out their accelerator program from scratch. I merged into a full-time role after I graduated, ran 5 accelerator programs for them, worked with 75 companies across a wide variety of industries, really got that. Not only the VC and the investment experience, but also the really hands-on experience of working with the companies through the accelerator ecosystem. And then in 2019, I left that job and went to join Big Idea Ventures. I really wanted to do something more mission-driven. I'm super passionate about fighting global climate change and human health and animal welfare. And Big Idea Ventures was a brand new company at the time. Again, I was one of the first employees. There's a bit of a recurring pattern here. And they were launching a fund focused on plant-based and cell-based alternatives to meat, dairy, and seafood products. So it seemed like a good way for me to merge the things that I'm passionate about, in my personal life with, what I was doing professionally. So I joined that team at BIV as one of the first employees. Again, built an accelerator program from scratch, worked with a lot of fantastic companies in alternative protein. And then for the last year and a half or so, I've been on BIV's special projects team, which is sort of like the internal innovation arm of our company. We launch new funds and initiatives focused on growing the firm. I'm building a later stage fund focused on food technology, a fund focused on commercializing university IP in food and food technology. And then we're also building a food co-manufacturing plant. So lots of really fun stuff going on.
Yeah, a lot of different projects. And it's interesting and awesome to hear. Right, you went to NYU Stern, that kind of forced you into this box of like finance and investment banking, and instead you went and became an entrepreneur and failed at it, right? Which you talked about, which I think is amazing because we forget that we can't be perfect. And it was in those failures that allowed you to go and build an accelerator program that, Quake, for those that don't know Quake, it's a pretty good program. And they've had some amazing companies that have gone and do amazing things based off that. It's same with BIV. Right. And then taking all that to also be an investor, right? Invest in companies, building funds to invest in amazing technology. Who better than somebody who's gone about the grant process, who's gone about being a founder, who's created programs from founders, learned from other mentors. Like, it takes experience to do these things. And so I love that you kind of bring all that and utilize that all into a passion, which for many people, it's hard to figure out passion meeting the job life and what does that look like. And you've, over time been able to find out those things. So when you think about, investing, right? And we look at how we invest in companies, and I get asked this all the time as a coach at 12 different accelerators, what do they look for? We always talk about, right, like scalability, the founding team, and traction, right? And a lot of times they don't. So what do you look for? What are some of those key indicators when you're evaluating companies that just stand out to you that you think people should be paying attention to outside of, like, obviously traction?
Sure. So I think this is a really important thing to keep in mind. And I think the media really does, both the VC space as well as the founders, as well as the founder space, a massive disservice by the way they talk about venture capital and venture capital fundraising. Mm-hmm. Because venture capital fundraising, venture capital investing is this super, super, super high risk, very niche investment strategy that is really only appropriate for a very small subset of companies. And those are the companies that want to grow really, really quickly, prioritize growth above all else, prioritize growth above profit, prioritize growth above, you can do it in a mission-driven fashion, but you're really putting growth first. And so if that isn't your priority as a founder and as a company, you shouldn't take VC money. And that's totally fine. That is a totally valid and totally fine way to do it. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And there's lots of other great ways to fund a business outside of VC capital that you can look at that don't get talked about and don't get highlighted and don't get spotlighted in the media, because the media just wants to talk about, so-and-so raised $100 million at a $6 billion valuation or whatever. And that's really what entrepreneurs are held for and seen as successful for, instead of, building a business that actually generates a lot of money. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Like when we're thinking about investments, especially for early stage VCs, and the earlier stage your fund mandate is, the more true this is, the vast majority of the companies are going to fail. It's such a risky investment strategy. We assume that 80 to 90% of our companies are probably either going to fail, or they're going to, have a small exit, or we'll get our money back. We won't really get that much of a return.
Yeah.
And then the rest, the remaining, 10 to 20%, they're going to need to return our entire fund. And they're going to need to produce spectacular returns, because for our limited partners, they're taking on a ton of risk of this very, very, very risky niche investment strategy. So if we don't have spectacular returns, they're going to go put their money into, the S&P 500 or something that's, a lot more secure. So that's the most important thing to keep in mind. You need to be the kind of business that has the potential to be a multi-billion-dollar company. Are you going to necessarily succeed at that? Not necessarily. I mean, we do our best to pick winners. No one's perfect. We're going to be right sometimes. We're going to be wrong sometimes. But you need to have that multi-billion-dollar business potential, and you need to be committed to that. And you need to come into the pitch selling that story. Because if you're not doing that, then you're not going to make sense for the VC model, because you don't have that potential to return the entire fund and produce those spectacular returns that we need. So that's the number one thing. I mean, there's other things we look for. Team is super important, especially at the early stages. Who the founders are, what their background looks like. Do we like them? Do we trust them? Do we want to work with them? I mean, this is a 7 to 10 year marriage at the end of the day that we're entering into with our founders. So if this isn't someone we trust and we think we can have a good relationship with, that's not somebody that we're going to trust with our capital.
Yeah. And I love that. I mean, it is like a marriage, right? And this relationship takes time. And, the VC model is very interesting for a number of reasons, but I like what you said here and kind of the strategy behind it. And I think the big things for any entrepreneur out there listening that's like hearing this needs to think about, and I tell entrepreneurs all the time, they need to look in the mirror. Not every entrepreneur, not every business I come across is a multi-billion-dollar business. And that's okay. You can have a multi-million-dollar business and go get funding and do all these amazing things. That's just going to come from a different place. That may not be the VC route for you. But I think so many founders, they're like, oh, here's our TAM, SAM, and SOM, and it's going to be amazing. And we're going to have 5 million in the first 4 years. We're going to be multi-billion by this time. And it's like, pump the brakes. Like, there needs to be some hard look in the mirror to understand what that looks like. And so I like how you brought up the team, and you can kind of tell from the founding team and their background, their experience, what they're trying to build and their vision, that you can kind of tell, like, where does that fall into billion or million, right? So I really appreciate you sharing that. And I think people that understand that the VC world is can be done mission driven and be done in a great way, but you need to understand why you're stepping into that. And you have to have the right mentality as a founder and as a company to walk into that. Otherwise, there's all kinds of other investment models to scale and grow quickly. And that's why I actually built this podcast around the bare necessities of entrepreneurship, was all these other podcasts and all the other content. It's like, you hear about the one major challenge, the one shining moment, and they get VC funding and they scale quickly. It's Uber, it's Airbnb, and it's like, that's 1 out of a million, right? Statistically. So what can companies be learning, doing, and thinking?
Right. We need to talk about failures more. I really think we need to talk about failures more as an industry, because you see the big successes and the big wins be talked about. You see the big exit talked about. You see the big fundraise talked about. A big fundraise, by the way, is not necessarily a big business win. There are so many companies that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital and have never built a sustainable, profitable business. And we've seen a lot of those very high profile failures lately. Some of them are fraudulent, like we're seeing Elizabeth Holmes in court now. And some of them are just, lackluster, like, WeWork, for example, a business that really didn't have the margins and the unit economics at the end of the day to justify the valuation and the hype that they had. And I think that, again, like having a, multi-million-dollar fundraise be splashed all over the headlines and having that being the benchmark that founders are going for, that's not conducive to an environment that's producing really impactful and profitable businesses.
Yeah. I love that. We need to talk about our failures more. And, what people don't realize too, a lot of the general public, I don't think understands, even some of the founders don't even understand this, is that just because a company gets a substantial raise doesn't mean that money goes into the bank. A lot of times it's paying off debt and other investments and all these other things. And so sometimes you see a big raise and you're like, they have all this money to scale and do this thing. It's like, actually, that might not be the case. They might not have near as much as you think to do what they need to do because there's all these back end things and people don't actually realize that. It's a very interesting game that you have to understand of the inner workings of why you go from Series A to Series B to Series C to Series D, right? One of the things I've always had a question on, and maybe you can shed some light, is I talk to so many founders that don't realize that in order to even go Series A, you need to have $1 million in ARR. Why do companies go Series A to B to C to D? What does that strategy look like, and how does that fit into what you do looking at early stage investment versus late stage investment in the work that you're doing?
So it's super heavily industry dependent. So for the companies we look at, I'm in a weird space because we do a lot of, alternative protein, future of food tech. And the companies that I look at are kind of split into two categories mostly. You've got plant-based CPG, so like food product innovation, consumer products companies. Generally, you want to see recurring revenue for those companies. You want to see revenue that's growing over time and recurring month over month and growth, new doors, new retail stores you're entering or new food service businesses you're entering because you're selling a product. This is a nuts and bolts business. It's making something and it's selling it. Then we also look at a lot of food technology companies, and those business models are totally different, especially, we do a lot of investments on the cell-based side and the microbial fermentation side, like companies that are doing cultivated meat in the lab. Those companies aren't going to have any revenue until some of the more realistic, some companies are saying 2023. I think, even for the best companies and the most realistic companies, I think 2024 or 2025 for really, really seeing truly cell-based products on the market. Microbial fermentation, there's some, but at the end of the day, those are technology companies. So you're investing in the intellectual property, and you see this in healthcare, biotech, pharmaceuticals as well. You see, pharmaceutical companies in the public markets with, hundreds of millions of dollars in enterprise value that have never made a dime because they're still going through clinical trials and they're getting regulatory approval, and you're really investing in the IP and in the technology. So I think it heavily depends on the sector that you're looking at. I think, for consumer products, you're generally seeing, for a Series A, you really need to be kind of a revenue generating company. Usually, generally, we're seeing valuations at, 6 to 8 times, 8 to 10 times in this crazy environment revenue. While for some of the more technology focused companies, the valuations and the size of the round and the series of the round can be a lot more fungible and a lot harder to pin down because it's really the technology that you're investing in and the value of that intellectual property.
I love that. I mean, and it surprises me still how many people I talk to that don't truly understand the levels, and they just see these things in the news, and it makes them not it makes them think, oh, that's a really great company. It's like, well, but why is it a great company? Or is that not a good thing that this company is still going for another round 15 years later, right? And I think that's really important. In fact, one of the things, a future book idea I have is talking about the startup cool effect. And when does a company stop being a startup, right? When does it really become a scale up? And we have so many coaches and industry leaders who are giving startup advice that is actually scale up advice. And so startup founders are trying to do it, and they're spending all their money doing something that's they're not ready for. And anyways, like kind of addressing what a startup to a scale up is in those different stages of life.
That is so so funny that you bring that up. I caught up with an old college friend last weekend, and she had just started a job at DoorDash. And the first words out of my mouth were, "Oh, that's so great! How are you liking the startup life?" And I'm like, "Wait, DoorDash is a public company now. Like, that's not the startup. Like, we've got all of these companies that we're used to thinking of as the unicorn success stories with the startup stories, and they're public." Or they're super, super, super late stage private companies. They've raised hundreds of $1 million in funding. They're more, private equity. They're going for a public offering, or they're more of a doing private equity style rounds. So it's a huge shift from when I first started in this industry 5 years ago to now thinking of the companies that were the hot startups at the time now becoming like the dinosaurs in a sense.
Yeah, it's crazy to think. And also when companies call themselves like a 10-year startup because they're trying to attract talent, I think from a company standpoint, they need to also like, hey, we're a public company. We're doing these things. We've hit these milestones. We have a startup vibe, but we're really a corporation. We have 1,000 employees. Like, you have to, I think the employer brand side of things also needs to flip that mentality too. That's crazy because I think the same thing. I'm like, oh, wait a second, that's no longer a startup.
Right.
But people are still talking about that as a startup story. And like, oh, the startup Airbnb. It's like, no, Airbnb it's not a startup anymore.
Yes.
It's way past its time. So anyways, that's a future Rob book idea that I
love it.
that
love it.
Kind of chaps me a little bit the wrong way when I hear people give advice to the wrong spaces. I kind of want to spend a few minutes because I know we're getting to the tail end of this. But I really want to talk about the future of food tech. And, you talked about your passion and why this is so important. So let's talk about it. As we look into 2022, we know that, plant-based alternatives in the food tech industry is continuing to change, evolve, and grow. So tell me a little bit, what do you see some of the things that people should be paying attention to next year? Some of the things you're passionate about in this space that we should be kind of like, hey, this is coming. This is something we should be looking forward to getting involved in or paying attention to as we turn the corner into 2022.
Oh, wow. I'm so passionate about this. I can talk about this for hours. So the plant-based space is interesting because I started in the space in 2019 and I've been in it for, a little over 2 years now. And it is worlds different today than it was. The amount of maturity, we were one of the first funds that was really taking plant-based seriously in early 2019. And it was this very revolutionary, cutting edge thing. And now it has become so crowded. There are so many great companies, great brands, great technologies in the space. We've invested in, over 65 companies at this point, and we're not nearly close, nowhere near close to being one of the few funds in the space anymore. We've done deals with NEA, Coastal Ventures is getting in the space. Some of these big generalist funds are really coming in and really, really trying to capitalize on that growth. So it's really matured an incredible amount for the last 2 years. I think we're starting to see, there's been a huge influx of investment into brands and technologies, and there has not been nearly enough investment in infrastructure, in my opinion. And I think that's something that we're going to start to need to see more of it, at least as far as plant-based goes. We're building a food manufacturing plant for that reason. That's something that consistently, both the startups in our portfolio as well as the large food corporates, a lot of our LPs are food corporations. We work with a lot of large food corporations. And universally, from big to small, all of these companies are struggling with production capacity. The infrastructure hasn't kept pace with the innovation. And I think that's a big something that we're going to start to see capital really flood into that space and start to catch up there. Outside of plant-based, some other trends that I think are really important to watch. I think plastic waste is huge. That's really something that's weighing on consumers' minds heavily, and large corporations are really starting to pay attention to. And then I'm a huge fan of regenerative agriculture. I think that's something that is really mission critical to helping us combat global climate change as it relates to the food space. I think there's a lot to be said for, it's one thing to say, yes, animal agriculture is bad, at least in the sense of, factory farming and the way that we've been doing it. You get a lot of, there's a lot of very passionate vegans in my space, right? And a lot of them will go on a podcast like this and they'll be like, animal agriculture sucks and we need to end it. And my views on the whole thing are, I think factory farming sucks and we need to end it. And I also think monocropping sucks and we need to end it. Or at least we need to rethink it and redo it in a way that's regenerative and brings nutrients back to the land and brings native plant and animal species back to the land that they're from. And we need to live a lot more in concert and in union with the land. And that's something that I think as a food system, we've really gotten away from with factory farming, both on the plant and animal side. So I think, whole ecosystems and thinking about our place in the ecosystem as a consumer is really important. And you don't get that just by going vegan if you're eating corn and soy products because the amount of deforestation and land use and water use and nutrient depletion and everything that's involved with growing those crops is not that much better for the environment than, what's being accomplished with conventional animal ag. So that's a long rant, but I think regenerative agriculture is something that I care a lot about, and I think it's something that if you care about the future of food, you really should be focusing on.
Yeah, well, I think that's important too for people to listen. Like whatever your views are on meat eating versus not, is things need to change, right? And as we grow and move forward with technology and advancements, like we need to rethink how we do things, right? Like think about how fast technology changes, but we don't change all the other things we're doing in the world. Like we need to speed up and really align everything together. And I think everyone who listens to this podcast, wherever you sit with it, you need to understand and listen and like learn, educate. Like there's so much that needs to happen for the future of all of us, our world, our food, the way we do things, the way we manufacture, the way we build out stuff. And we have to be the change we want to see and be talking about these. So I love it. That's why I wanted to give you that space and place to talk about it a little bit, because it's a space that I haven't done a whole lot of research into, but been learning more into it about where those impacts are made. Growing up in the Midwest, you and I both know plenty of people with farms and how that's affected their lives and how their farm has either grown or not grown in the year. So I wanted to give some space and place. And I know we're out of time, but I want to ask you one or two final questions that I always like to end each one of these episodes are. And the first one is, what do you think is your superpower?
Oh, wow. I get this question a lot. And I the best answer I've come up with so far is brutal honesty. It is a superpower and it is also a fatal flaw at the same time. I think every superpower is a fatal flaw in a sense. You've got the part of it that's good. Anything that's powerful, you've got a good side to it and a bad side to it. So, I'm brutally honest. I always say what I think. If it's in my brain, it's coming out my mouth. Fortunately or unfortunately, and that has gotten me a lot of really great success and helped me make a lot of great connections and get a lot of great things in my life, but it's also gotten me in a lot of hot water. Yeah.
Well, I think I agree with you. I mean, everyone who's anyone, when they talk about their superpower, it always works for the better. And the reason why it's a superpower is it always usually works more for the good, but there's always something to it. And I think what I love about that answer, it being a fatal flaw, is that if you don't realize the negative side or the other side of it, how can you have an opinion or how can you know it's something that's good if you don't understand the negative?
Right.
Going back to everything we've talked about today, VC stuff, the plant-based stuff, like we talk about it, there's a good and a bad side. If you don't understand that, good side of VC and the bad side, good side of, manufacturing and bad side, and we make those comparisons, you'll never learn and grow. So that's why I love that you know that about yourself. And that's self-awareness is a huge thing that many people don't have. Um, what is a book or resource or show that you would recommend? What's that kind of all-time thing that people should be adding to their list of content?
My favorite book to recommend is the book called The Four Agreements.
Okay.
It's the best life book I've ever read. It's super applicable to business as well. It's really short. You could read it in an hour or two. And it's just, really, really simple lessons for how to live your life as a good person. And I think a lot of it, we live in a world that is so full of noise. And there's so many blogs and there's so many podcasts and everyone's got a Twitter and everyone's got a LinkedIn and everyone's got an opinion on everything and everyone's trying to stay relevant. And I think, this book is just such a great, simple, back to basics, first principles book. Like, hey, these are 4 really easy, simple, critical things to keep in mind to be a good person, lay a good foundation for ethics, morals, how to treat people. And that's something that I think we need more of in our society to help us wade through a lot of the noise that's out there.
I love it. You know what I need to do? As you were talking about that, I've talked about how I add all these books to my list. It's a very selfish question, but it's also of value to the listeners. But I should just create a guide, like every book or show recommended on the podcast, and put it on my website. So I just thought of that as you're talking.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to put that on there. Awesome. So last question, having been an entrepreneur and going through it yourself and working with entrepreneurs, what advice would you give to, a Gen Z, a millennial, or anyone who wants to be an entrepreneur right now that they should be taking away?
Yes. Everybody's a person. Everybody's a human being. This seems like it would be really obvious, but it's the thing that I see people lose touch with the most with fundraising and anytime money comes into play. You are a human being. As an entrepreneur, you're a human being. You're going to make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. It's a natural part of the process. And your investor and the person that you're pitching is also a human being. And raising money and the process of raising money is all about relationships. Investors want to invest in people that they know, that they trust, and that they like, and that they want to work with, and that they think they can have a really good professional relationship with, back to the 7 to 10 year long marriage, right? It's all about your relationship with the person. And so having a really strong network and a bunch of great relationships, and by that, I don't mean you go to a networking event and you hand out a bunch of business cards. I mean, you get to know people as people and you build real relationships and you get to know people for who they are. And then, you do business with them when you can trust them and you can really get to know them. And I think we've gotten to a point where a lot of people approach fundraising in particular in this very transactional fashion. And they think, they look at investors as vehicles to capital and not as business partners. When at the end of the day, you want investors that are going to bring value to your business beyond just capital. You don't want dumb money on your cap table. You want people that are going to be good partners to you. You want people that are going to give you good advice. You want people that are going to bring mentorship and resources to the table. You want people that are going to be understanding and are going to support you when times inevitably get tough. And if you're not vetting those investors the same way that they're vetting you, you're going to end up in a bad situation. So everyone's a person, including you, and treat everybody accordingly.
I mean, I love this. You said 2 things, one in the front end and one back here, that we need to talk about failures more. We are people. We're human. We're going to make mistakes. And we can never find success unless we fail, right? There's this, especially in a hyper-connected world, everyone wants to be perfect, but how the fuck do you know what perfect is if you don't fail? And understand that as you build these relationships, as you go through this process of growing a business, creating relationships, getting funding, you're going to make mistakes, you're going to fail. And when you're honest with it and you call it out and you put that on the table and you talk about it, that's where people build that trust, because you know and have self-awareness. And that is something, to tie this whole episode back, you brought it up in the beginning and the end, and I absolutely love it. It's something that we were talking pre-show. It just makes me excited because we don't talk about it enough. So, Abby, I appreciate you for being a part of the Bare Necessities podcast and part of Bare Nation. Where can people find you? How can they get in touch with you if they want to connect after the show?
Email is probably best. It's just my first name, Abby, Abby, at bigideaventures.com. I do have a LinkedIn. I'm bad with social media, so my response time to email will be significantly more, shorter and more likely to get a response than it's on LinkedIn, unfortunately.
On LinkedIn. Awesome. Well, I'll put your email in the show notes. I'll also put your LinkedIn. Shameless plug. This is why you should go read my book, The Social Soul. If you're not great with social, this explains why you should be an engager and why you should be active on it. Little eye wink there for those that are listening in. Exactly. I love it. Abby, thank you so much for being a part of the show, being a part of Bear Nation. I really appreciate you. And to Bear Nation, stay tuned for the next episode. Thank y'all. Bear Nation, once again, thank you for listening to the Bare Necessities of Entrepreneurship. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a review. And until next time, take care.